When we were working on the conference and I thought about who I might be able to get to keynote the conference, I wanted to find someone that could be relevant to all of you, who could teach you and who could inspire you. But I never thought I would be able to bring someone of the caliber of Dr. Leonard Marcus to speak to you today. Dr. Marcus is the co-director of the National Preparedness Leadership Initiative at Harvard University, which is a joint program between the School of Public Health and the Kennedy School of Government. And one of the odd things that have happened to me post-tornado, I got to attend that program as the scholarship diversity student in my group. And so now I get to say this is Lenny, which is really different. How would I ever think I could say that about a Harvard professor? So that's pretty exciting for me just in general. But Lenny is approachable, he is thoughtful, he's inspiring, and he's been able to be at the center of many disaster experiences to learn from that. You know, obviously in his own community, the Boston Marathon bombing was close at hand for him. He was around Katrina, he was around the H1N1 virus, not the virus specifically, sorry, but I should say that in another way, shouldn't I? But around the whole response to that. He was around Katrina, he was at the Deepwater Horizon, he's been in many places and he's observed and learned a lot. And what he's going to talk about today, I think, is a topic that, if there's anything that's important for you, this is one of them, because when a disaster comes, you may be called on to lead. And there are specific skills, I think, that come with leading in disasters. When I took the class, I listened, and so many times I could say, I saw that in Joplin. I recognize it in someone that I know. And I've learned, hopefully, how to be a better leader as a result of that. But it's a thrill to have Dr. Marcus with us as our keynote speaker. As a reminder, when he's done today, lunch will be downstairs in the Lion's Den. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to my good friend, Dr. Leonard Marcus.
Well, it's a pleasure to be here. When Jane listed all of those places that I'd been, and it is true that when crises occur, we are invited to sit with the leader and talk with them and debrief them during crises. So, in fact, when Mike Brown was leading the Katrina event, I had the opportunity, because we had been in a dialogue up to that point. He said, well, you want to study leadership, come on down. So I was there when that transition occurred. During Deepwater Horizon, followed Admiral Thad Allen, an extraordinary leader, through that crisis, CDC, et cetera. But one of the places Jane didn't mention was Joplin. And for many, many years, I've been looking forward to coming to Joplin. And it's a tremendous honor and a privilege to have been invited here to be with you today. First off, I just have to tell you about Jane. So we have a crisis leadership program at the university, at Harvard, and we have people as our students who are senior leaders from cross-government, cross-industry, nonprofits, a lot of pretty impressive people. And it's not easy getting into Harvard. So every year we have our applications, and comes in an application from a woman from Missouri, and she's just in that pile of applications. And we're about to go through them, and I get a call from FEMA. Well, Jane Cage applied to the NPLI, the National Preparedness Leadership Initiative. You ought to let her in. Oh, okay, fine, thank you. Then I get a call from headquarters at Department of Homeland Security, who tells me, Jane Cage applied for your program, you ought to let her in. Well, at that point, I was almost convinced when I get a call from the White House to tell me, Jane Cage applied for your program, you ought to let her in. And we did. And Jane has become a teacher, she's become friend, and I'm honored to say student of our work on leadership. Jane has actually done something even more impressive than simply getting into Harvard. And I want to say that for everyone here, that Joplin has come to symbolize something in this country. And I hope to hold a mirror up to you so that you can understand just what you mean for this United States of America. And by the way, I have tremendous respect for all of the other communities that are represented here and the crises that you've been through and your willingness to come here to Joplin to share your stories. However, Joplin is the city that has brought us all together. And it's been moving for me today to meet people from Los Angeles, to meet people from the West Coast and the East Coast, from up and down the Midwest, who see Joplin as a place where we can come and learn and be inspired. So a great thanks to Joplin for doing this for our country. And Jane, you have been the international ambassador for Joplin, so thank you for bringing us all together. So first off, I have to say, for anyone who knows me, this is the first time that I've given a talk without PowerPoints. And if you can let all my friends at Harvard know that I did this, I'd be really, really happy. So there are no PowerPoints today. And not only that, I decided not to prepare my speech till I got here this morning, which is also pretty unusual. And the reason I did that is because whenever I go someplace, I always discover something. And I was eager to figure out what I would discover here and how that would inspire me. So I didn't write my speech till just a few minutes ago across the hallway. And the theme is the human spirit. And what I have experienced here in Joplin, and what I've heard in speaking to so many people since I've been here, and now putting that in the context of everything that I learned about Joplin before I came from Jane, from people in FEMA who were part of the response here, from people who I've met, who live here. It's really a story of the best of the human spirit and what we can do when we truly work together. Now, I am first and foremost a student of leaders. I'm fascinated by leaders. I'm fascinated by what they do, what they don't do. And that fascination has turned into a passion for teaching leadership. And so I'm going to do something that I have rarely ever done before in the spirit of the human spirit. I'm going to do that. I'm going to tell you that story. And then I'm going to take you through this piece of paper. And before we end today, I'm going to teach you a little bit about meta-leadership and the dimensions of meta-leadership. And what you're going to discover when I go through this is, hey, he's talking about me. And what we've done in this background on meta-leadership is to capture the best of what leaders do in times of crisis. And you're not going to learn anything new, but some of you might say, oh, now I have a vocabulary to describe what I do. On the back page, I'm going to share with you, towards the end of my talk, what we've learned about swarm leadership in our observation of leaders during the Boston Marathon bombings response, and perhaps encourage you to reflect on the extent to which swarm leadership existed here in Joplin or in other communities in the aftermath of a crisis, and to ponder how you might be able to build the principles and rules of swarm leadership in how you plan and how you lead in times of crisis. So sometimes one can learn about something by looking at it from both sides. So the human spirit. And I might not make it through it without a little bit of a pause. So my father is a Holocaust survivor. He grew up about a block and a half from where my mom grew up in a small town in western Poland by the name of Radziew. It takes about 2.5 hours to drive from Warsaw to to Rajia. As part of my own leadership development, I was very fortunate to get a fellowship from the Kellogg Foundation when they were running the Kellogg National Leadership Program. And Kellogg sent me to my parents' hometown to help me understand how their experience would translate into my leadership and into my teaching of leadership. And so I went in 1988 to visit Rajia. So the story of my family is that my mother and her nuclear family, she was 15 years old at the time, got out of that town, got out of Poland because my mother's uncles had emigrated to the United States, so they were able to get papers, and they left Poland in November 1938. My father was an only child, wasn't as fortunate, so they were in Poland when the Nazis invaded. My dad and his father were taken away to a forced labor camp. While my dad was with his father, he was able to keep him alive. His father was quite ill. But at some point they realized he was only 15 years old. He was too young to be in a labor camp, so they kicked him out. And as my father learned, shortly thereafter, his father died. People knew what was happening in that time and knew that the Nazis were going from community to community and literally wiping out all of the Jews in a community one at a time. And so my grandmother knew that the next day the Nazis would be coming for them. And so she packed a bag and literally forced my father out of the house against his will. And in the bag was a change of clothes and a little bit of food, and she told him, "Go and hide." And so he hid in a haystack. He burrowed deep into a haystack, and as he told the story, he tried to get the hay so that it looked like there was nothing in there. He heard the Nazis walking around the haystack looking for people who were hiding. My grandmother was taken to the town hall, and from the square near the hall, they were marched up into a church, and from the church they were put into trucks. And while those trucks went to an area of burial, they were asphyxiated in the trucks, and then they were buried in a large pit. I actually went to that town. I followed where those trucks were. I went to the places where they were taken so that I could experience it for myself. So my dad was liberated by American troops just outside of Dachau in March 1945. After his hiding, he eventually went to a labor camp because that was a way that he could work and survive. There were many times he had near misses with death. Once he was put into a death line, and he figured out this wasn't a good place to be, and he snuck out and got over to the work line. While he was working as a forced laborer in a steel manufacturing company, a beam fell on his leg, and part of it was amputated. And a doctor came to him and said, "If you don't go back to work, they'll make quick business out of you." So with all the pain and all of that difficulty, he went back to work and he survived. And there were numerous stories of his survival. The one that I remember most vividly, and that's relevant for us here today, is the story of his movement from Auschwitz, which is in Poland, back towards Germany when the Germans were retreating towards the end of the war. It was January 1945. A number of inmates from Auschwitz were put into a very large train. These were open coal cars. So they were packed with people. They were given no food, no water, no provisions, no coats, nothing. It was just part of the retreat. And as he told the story, they went from train station to train station. And he said when we got to a station, the Nazis would come through and they threw off all the dead bodies. And he said if we were lucky, and this was exactly his words, he said peasants would come up to the train and throw bread at the train, and that was the only food we had. And day after day, the train trudged through Czechoslovakia toward Dachau, and of course he didn't know his fate. One day he said that they stopped at a train station, and a man who had died was thrown off, and there a pile of bodies right next to the train. And someone who was on the train turned to the German soldier and said, "There's a man over there with a coat. I'm very cold. Could I go and get the coat off of him?" And the soldier said yes. And my dad said that he jumped off the train and he walked up to the pile of dead bodies. And he said, and he bent down to take the coat off, and the soldier came behind him and shot him in the back, and he fell into the pile of dead bodies. And my father said that was the moment that I gave up. Because he said, I realized that human life had no value, and so he gave up. So the train continued on, and they got to the next station. And once again, they went through the same ritual, and once again, people came up and threw food at the train. And he said at one point, someone threw a whole loaf of bread up to the train, and it hit the side, and it fell down on the ground. And my dad said he looked down at the bread, and he looked up, and there were soldiers walking. And he said, at that moment, I gave up. There was no longer any point in trying to continue surviving. So he said, I decided to jump off the train, knowing that I would be killed, but I wanted it to end. I didn't want to survive anymore. So he jumped off the train, and he picked up the loaf of bread. Now at that point, my thought was, well, he would grab a piece so that his last moment, he would be eating something. He described the fact that he was starving at that time. And he said, and he picked up the loaf of bread, and he was standing there, and there was a German soldier right in front of him, and they stared at one another. He said, and then he took the loaf of bread, and he threw it up to the train. And the German soldier was staring at him and didn't know what to do. And there was a stare-off, and my dad didn't know what was going to happen next. And he said the German soldier froze. And then he walked up to him, he hit him, and told him to get back up into the train. And he climbed up into the train, and by the time he got there, there was no more bread. But he said, once he got back on the train, he decided he wanted to live again. And when I was very, very young, my dad kept on telling me stories of the war. By the time I could understand English, he was telling me stories about crematoria, and he was telling me stories about death marches, and he told me that story and a lot of stories. So that by the time I was 6, I said, Dad, why are you telling me all these stories over and over again? He said, and of course I was his first son. I was born not long after the Holocaust. And I said, Dad, why are you telling me these stories? And he said, because your job is to make sure it never happens again. It's a pretty big mission for a 6-year-old. But I decided that I'll take on that responsibility. And that story really inspired me. And what inspired me about that story is that when my dad and that German soldier locked eyes, they became human beings to one another. And once they were human beings to one another, they lit for one another a sense of hope. And if you don't have that sense of hope, you can't move on. You can't go on. And ironically and wonderfully, hope is what we give to one another. It's why we do what we do. And if we can give one another that sense of hope, even my dad, who was an inmate in the Holocaust, able to give that sense of humanity and hope to that soldier, who my dad thought was going to kill him, and who couldn't kill him. And I asked myself, and I asked him, why didn't he kill you? And the answer was, after he had thrown the bread away, rather than eating it, he became a human being. He could kill a thing. He couldn't kill a human being. So I'm 6 years old trying to figure this out. And well, by the time I was 8 years old, I was asking, how did this happen? And if I'm supposed to make sure it doesn't happen again, what do you do with that? So as I was growing, I decided that the reason that it happened is because of large organizations. My dad described the crematoria. He described the labor camps. He described the trains. There are these large organizations. And then I asked him, well, how could these large organizations do that? He said, well, because people told them to do it. And so I came to the conclusion by the time I was an adolescent that it was organizations and their leaders. And so I became very, very committed to studying organizations, to studying leaders, all with the hope of making them better. I wasn't going to be able to go back in history and prevent the bad things from happening again, but I could make a contribution to the whole study and the practices of leadership. So I became very committed to that. So by the time I was 15 years old, I started teaching seminars on leadership. But I was rather feisty. And now, by the way, I'm not going to make you do this, but I will tell you the story. So I started teaching seminars on leadership, and I came to the conclusion that leaders could do terrible things. They could do terribly unethical things, and they could also do good things. And when I tell you this story, I had my students, when I was 15 years old, do this exercise, and I also have my students, my matriculating students at Harvard, still have to do this exercise today. And what I say to them is, okay, everybody stand up. And all my students stand up. And then I say, sit down. And they all sit down. And then I say, stand up. And they all stand up. And then I say, sit down. And they all sit down. Then I say, once again, stand up. At this point, some of them don't stand up. And then I say, sit down. And then I ask people, well, why did you stand up? And it turns into a really interesting discussion about leadership. Some students say, well, I stood up because you told me to stand up. Well, because you're the professor. Because if I don't stand up, you might flunk me. I mean, there were lots of really interesting reasons. But a few students didn't stand up. And I asked them, why didn't you stand up? And that's really where the interesting conversation comes. Because we need to understand what's great about leaders and leadership. And we need to understand what can be problematic about leaders and leadership. And I'm of the belief that we can best understand that greatness and how wondrous and how incredible the human spirit can be when we also understand how dark it can be. So I then had a passion for leadership. And the way I translate that passion today is I keep asking people, why do you lead? And that is a question that I asked for any and everybody who it would be willing to ask it. And I also encourage all of my students, and I'll encourage you as well, to ask yourself why you lead every single day. Because you never know when you wake up whether that's the day that you will be challenged. Certainly, on this day, you of Joplin were challenged to lead. You in Tuscaloosa and Minot and in other places had the day when you were challenged to lead. And then ask other people why they lead as well. We encourage our students at Harvard always to remember what's their passion as a leader. And of course, we ask our matriculating students as well. Many times, people don't stop to ask themselves why they're leading. And so in our class, for our matriculating Harvard students, they're given an assignment. We have a very intensive leadership program. They're given an assignment one night, one page, where they have to describe their passion for leadership. And interestingly, they come in the next morning, their eyes are red, a little bit teary, and a number of the students have said that that was the most difficult assignment they'd ever been given at Harvard. And Harvard can give you some pretty difficult assignments. And what they've said is that reflecting on why they lead, what their passion is, what's the fuel that gets them to do what they do, is just a difficult question that many hadn't ever pondered. And the one I'll always remember is a medical student who came in that next morning, red-eyed, teary-eyed, and we had a class discussion. She raised her hand, and she said, I never realized why I'm doing what I'm doing. I never realized why I went to medical school. I never realized why I was passionate for coming to Harvard until last night. And she said, I sat down and I tried to figure it out. And she said, and all of a sudden it came to me. When I was 5 years old, my little sister, who was 3 years old, died. And as a 5-year-old, it was a very, very disturbing experience for me. And she said, I made a promise to myself then that no more sisters would die. And here I am in Harvard Medical School. And I never figured out just how I had gotten here. So, first lesson is, first ask yourself why you do what you do. And as Jane will know, because I asked her once again last night, why do you lead? you'll get some really, really interesting answers from yourself. And I ask myself this question on a regular basis, and then ask other people why they lead. Because if we really understand what is that fuel, what's burning inside of us, why we do what we do, what I find is actually we can do it a lot better. So there I am at Harvard. I'm having a really good time. It's a neat place. You get to meet some really fascinating people. And it's shortly after 9/11. At the time, I was directing what's called the Program for Healthcare Negotiation and Conflict Resolution. And I was teaching courses on leadership in the School of Public Health. I felt doing good. Teaching courses on conflict resolution, trying to resolve the debates of the day regarding healthcare. And it was the way I had invested all of that energy to lead and lead well and be a good human being, when we get a call from the External Relations Office at the university. And they said, "What's this $1 million grant you just got?" And there were two of us on the call. We said, "Well, we didn't apply for a grant." They said, "Yes, you did, and you were funded." So I said, "Well, what were we funded to do?" This really happened. And they said, "Bioterrorism Preparedness." And I said, "I don't know a thing about bioterrorism preparedness." And so if you remember back on the time, there were the attacks on the World Trade Center and the Pentagon and the crash in Pennsylvania, and then there were anthrax attacks right afterwards. And so Congress, being Congress, does what it does. It appropriated $2 billion to the CDC with the charge, "Stop Bioterrorism." And what the CDC did is take $25 million of that money, which is not a lot, and gave it to 25 universities and said, "Get to work." We weren't told exactly what to do. We weren't told exactly how to go about doing it, but we were just told, "Get to work." And so I first went to colleagues in Massachusetts and said, "Well, I do conflict resolution, do leadership. What are the conflict resolution and leadership problems pertaining to bioterrorism?" And for those of you who were around at the time, there was a lot of conflict about smallpox and what to do about that, so got involved in that. And then I had some students at Harvard from Israel, and of course Israel was on the front line of a lot of the tension that was going on. So I went to Israel and I studied how they were dealing with bioterrorism, smallpox, anthrax, etc. And I wrote a report, and at the end of the report, it said, and Israel was ready for a smallpox attack. They had put together a whole system so that if smallpox were to be found anywhere in the world, and people believed at the time Saddam Hussein had smallpox and he was going to release it, and they literally opened up their doors so I could see their whole system. I watched them vaccinating people, and they showed me the distribution system, and I wrote it down in a report and sent it to 3 people. Unbeknownst to me, one of the people who I sent it to is head of infectious disease in Massachusetts, L. D. Maria, forwarded my report without my permission to Richard Knox, somebody I'd known for many years, the health reporter for National Public Radio. So Richard called me up and said, "Hey, Lenny, I got your report." I said, "Oh, really? How'd you get it?" And he said, "Well, I want to do a story on NPR about your report." I said, "Okay." So he came over to the school. He did the interview in the hallway. We couldn't find a quiet place to do it. And that weekend, there I was talking on NPR about bioterrorism preparedness here in the United States. Now, just for the record, I went from I don't know a thing about bioterrorism to being a national expert in a matter of weeks. And so got very much into this realm. And what was most fascinating for me at the time was how little was known about this. I mean, our country has the advantage of we're surrounded by 2 friendly oceans and 2 friendly countries. And we really hadn't pondered what it would mean to mount an effort against an attack on the homeland. And of course, 9/11 was a big wake-up call. So I pursued this question of leadership and how it related to bioterrorism, and looked at some of the problems pertaining to leadership and started writing about this. And all of a sudden, the CDC came back and said, "We think that bad leadership is a public health risk factor. Just like smoking is a public health risk factor or drunk driving is a public health risk factor, we think bad leadership is a public health risk factor." Well, now this is beginning to get my interest. And they said, "And we want you at Harvard to establish a platform that will study leaders and leadership, that will teach leaders and leadership, and set a standard for the country about leadership for crises, for disasters, for homeland security. And, this was the tough part, you've got to involve the whole spectrum, the whole enterprise of people that are involved in this. So I just want to remind you, I'm at a school of public health, and we were told you had to bring the military in, the intelligence community, the private sector, the nonprofit sector. You got to bring in the whole enterprise. Well, fortunately, at that brunch was David Gergen and myself. David, for those of you know, is the director of the Center for Public Leadership at the Kennedy School of Government. Really, really good guy. You often will see him on CNN these days. And so it's David and me, and you know, what could you say after 9/11? We both said, we'll do it. And we had a founding meeting in November 2003 at the Harvard Faculty Club. There were faculty members from across the university there. Ash Carter, who is on the faculty now, the Secretary of the Department of Defense, was there. And Harvard made a commitment to join the steep learning curve with the country on understanding leadership for crises, for disasters, for terrorism. And that was the beginning of the National Preparedness Leadership Initiative. And what we committed ourselves to doing is to be with leaders in times of crisis, to listen to what they have to say, and then to take what they've said and to put it into frameworks and patterns that then we could teach to other leaders. In many ways, this would be a guide for their leadership. And so that's what we started doing. And I was on my way to Maine to deliver a lecture about leadership for preparedness and response. And I called up my dad. And of course, remember right after 9/11, it was a pretty scary time. And I called up my dad and I said, Dad, I finally figured it out. When you said, you've got to make sure this doesn't happen again, this is what you were talking about. And that's the reason why it's so inspiring for me to be here in Joplin. Because you've done good here. And you've displayed extraordinary leadership here. And you are a model and an inspiration and an ambassador to our country for what leadership can be at its best. And so for that reason, it's a real honor to be here tonight and today. And tonight, I'm going to fly up to Milwaukee and spend some time with my dad tomorrow. And I'm going to tell him about you. Because you are the best answer to his standing beside that train and throwing the bread up and reminding humanity what it means to be human beings. And you're an inspiration for that, and that's why we do what we do. So I want to share with you just what those leadership frameworks are. So if you take this piece of paper and look at it on this side. So it's got this little circle here. So I'm going to tell you the story of meta-leadership in the hope that first you're going to say, hey, I've been doing that all the time, I just never had a word for it, and in the hope that you might be able to practice it as well. So in November 2003, we inaugurated the NPLI at Harvard. The next week, David and I went down to the White House and met with the President's Homeland Security Advisor and talked with him about what we're doing. And the fellow said to us, leadership is critically important, do this. And he said, and one of the big problems that we have is that the whole of government is siloed. You have to help us break down the silos. Now, I've lived in Boston for 40 years, but I grew up here in the Midwest, in Milwaukee. And, you know, here in the Midwest, we think silos are good things. You store your corn in silos, hops in silos. Silos are good things. And so I said to him, you don't want to break down the silos. You want to make the silos stronger, and you want to make sure that they're working together, that you've got connectivity of effort. So he said, yeah, okay, whatever. So we then began our study. So the next month, December 2003, one of the people who we studied was a fellow by the name of Joe Henderson, who's the director of the Office for Terrorism Preparedness and Emergency Response at the CDC. And I said to Joe, I'd like to study you as a leader as a way of understanding what are some of the challenges and problems that you're having now, and he agreed. So Joe would call me just about every day, And I'll tell you who the leader that I'm studying is now before we get to the end. So at that time, Joe was calling me every day, and I'm still in touch with Joe on a daily basis. And it was December 2003, and he called and said, "Did you hear that Secretary Ridge, Secretary of the Department of Homeland Security, just called an orange alert?" I said, "Yeah, I did." And I knew Joe was about to go on Christmas break with his family. So Joe says to me, "I'm going up to Washington." So I said, "Joe, what do you need to go to Washington for? You've got a secure cable. You can be in touch with Washington from Atlanta and be with your family." He said, "No," and I quote, "Public health needs to be in the room," which means the perspective of how anything would affect the population needs to be part of the understanding. So Joe goes up to Washington, and he goes into the room where they're sifting through all that intelligence. And, like most of us, the first time you go to a new committee meeting, you try and figure out who's who, what's the strategy, where they're going. And Joe said, there was no strategy, there was no direction. Everybody was in a panic mode. So he said, so I went back to the secure side, the Washington side of that secure cable, and they had been talking about some pretty scary stuff. Smallpox attack, anthrax, botulinum poisoning, tularemia, maybe a dirty bomb, dirty nuclear bomb, or a real nuclear bomb detonated in a large American city. Scary stuff. So Joe went back to the Washington side of that secure cable, put together 6 working groups back in Atlanta. One group worked on smallpox, one group worked on anthrax, and they had 48 hours to put together a large spreadsheet. And at the top it said how many people would die, how many people would be injured, what would be the impact on the critical infrastructure, what should the federal government do, what should the president do, a whole series of questions on top. And then 0 hours, what would it look like in the moment of the attack? And then 1 hour, what would it look like 1 hour later, 3 hours, 6 hours, 12 hours, 24 hours, and in increments all the way up to 30 days. And each group focused on one threat. They had 48 hours, and after 48 hours, they sent it back to Joe. He assembled that report in Washington and then walked into the room with all of those different people. Now, Joe, don't forget, is a second-tier leader within the Center for Disease Control and Prevention. And the CDC itself is a second-tier agency within the Department of Health and Human Services. Joe goes in with his report. So he's speaking to people from Department of Defense, Department of Homeland Security, Department of Health and Human Services, White House Homeland Security Council. Joe makes his report. They all accepted it. They were very impressed with his strategic thinking, where he was going with it, what should be done with it. He understood the situation. He understood what needed to be done. The person from the White House Homeland Security Council took Joe's report back to the White House, used it to brief the National Security Council. They were so impressed that the NSC took Joe's report, put it into a brief, and used it to brief the President of the United States. 3 weeks later, I went down to Atlanta to debrief Joe about his experience. When he was done telling me the story, I said, "Joe, that wasn't leadership." And I was trying to figure out the right word to describe what he had done. And the word that came to mind was the word meta-research. And what a meta-researcher will do is look at a whole body of research, like say 20 different studies about heart disease, even though every study looked at a different variable, and say, well, from all of these different studies, even though they studied different things, here are the conclusions, or here are the recommendations that derive out of that set of studies. So that's called meta-research. So I said, "Joe, that wasn't leadership," and the word that popped out of my mouth was, that was meta-leadership. That was a wide view of what the problems were and a wide notion of what needed to be done about them. So we had this term meta, and the prefix meta means reaching out above and beyond, or big picture. So we had this term meta-research. But we didn't know what it meant. We didn't know how to practice it. We didn't know how to teach it. So we invited Joe to come up to Harvard. And in our conference room, we have a whiteboard. So someone went up to the whiteboard, we're trying to figure this out, and drew a circle right in the middle. For you, it's that blue circle in the middle. And said, it starts with you. It's who you are. It's your passion for leadership. It's your personality. It's your character. And one of the things we've come to recognize, there's also a little bit of brain science in this. And so we recognize how the brain deals with a crisis as an important aspect of being able to lead. And we came up with the term going to the basement The basement, by the way, is not the basement that we usually think of here in the Midwest, but rather the basement is that part of your brain right down here, oftentimes called your reptilian brain. And what happens when you're in a crisis situation, there's a little structure inside your brain called your amygdala. And what your amygdala does is it's constantly surveying the situation. As long as everything is safe, your amygdala is quiet, your heartbeat is relatively normal, everything is fine. However, if all of a sudden a large boulder came crashing into this room, our amygdala would ignite, it would send us to the basement, and you might notice right now that your heartbeat is just a little bit faster because your amygdala got a signal that something's wrong. And that process of going to the basement happens almost instantaneously. The problem is if you're a crisis leader and you're in the basement, it's not a good situation. Because what happens, your brain is designed to help you survive. And when you're in the basement, the only thing that your brain can do, and think of it in terms of a rabbit, is freeze, flight, fight. So if a rabbit's out in the wild and a predator comes along, it will freeze, try and blend in, camouflage itself in the environment. If the predator gets close, the rabbit will run away, flight. And if the predator gets close, the rabbit will fight. Now what's interesting about the human brain is we have exactly those same structures and exactly those same behaviors built into what we call the basement. So when you go to the basement, that's all that you can do. That's not the place from which to lead. Therefore, it's important to get into what we call your toolbox, that mid-level brain of your routines, everything you've practiced before, your policies and protocols. We call that like the reset button on your computer. You know, when your computer freezes, you got to reset it. So by going into everything you've learned, everything you've exercised in your mid-level brain, you calm yourself down. You've gotten yourself out of the basement. And as a leader, you give people instructions of what to do that gets them up into their toolbox. And once they're in the toolbox, now they're working. Now they're focused. Now they're helpful. And then as a leader, you can get up to the highest level of your thinking, what we call your laboratory, and say, here's what's going on in this crisis. Here's what we're doing. Here's what needs to happen. How do we close the gap? So part of the first dimension of meta-leadership, the person, is understanding your behavior and understanding how to do better. Now, if you're interested in more on this, and this is just one sheet, go to the website for the NPLI. There's a whole paper, you can get it for free, that goes into much greater depth about the practices of meta-leadership. The large round red circle. So we had that blue circle on the board, and somebody went up and drew a bigger circle around that middle one. So there's the person and said, you're in a situation. You didn't create the situation. Your job as a meta leader is to figure out what's going on and what should be done about it. And to go back to the Joe story, that's what he did. And hearing your stories here in Joplin, there was extraordinary leadership to figure out, here's the situation that we've got here. What should we be doing about it? And getting a lot of people, extraordinary leadership, getting a lot of people focused and working first in rescue and recovery, first finding people, beginning the recovery process, really getting folks directed. That's the understanding of the situation. The third dimension of meta leadership is building connectivity of effort. And you lead as a meta leader in multiple directions. You lead down to the people who are your subordinates. And if you work in an organization, those are the people who call you boss. You lead up to your boss, and sometimes you got to say to your boss, hey boss, you're in the basement. Or boss, there's some information that we think that you need to have. Or boss, we need to get more data here. We need to look at this situation. That's the point of leading up. And then you have to lead across to the enterprise of people who have to be brought together in their response to any kind of a crisis. Leading across to other people within your organization. So take FEMA, a lot of people need to be brought together, different parts of that system. Or think of the federal government leading across Department of Homeland Security and EPA and all the different organizations that need to be brought together. And leading beyond to the enterprise of nonprofit, business organizations, government organizations, voluntary organizations that can be brought together. And everything I've read, and everything I've heard, and everything I've seen about what happened here in Joplin exemplifies a lot of meta-leadership. You really looked very broadly at what was going on here. You reached out to one another. You were very persistent. You got out of the basement and you helped people. So my hope in my presentation of meta-leadership is you'll say, oh, now I've got a name for what we've been doing all along, and that's called meta-leadership. Now, on the other side of the paper, so we study leaders in times of crisis. That oftentimes means that we have to get on an airplane. I will tell you that the agency that we're working with right now very closely is the Transportation Security Administration. Now, I know what you're thinking. That's not the problem. In fact, I had joked with the administrator, you know, for those of you who listen to NPR, there's a show, Wait, Wait, Don't Tell Me. And I said, Peter, if they ever get you on the show, they're going to have to call it Wait, 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 Wait. But that's not the problem. And if you needed any evidence for that, the real problem comes out of the plane that came down in Sharm el-Sheikh, the Metrojet plane, the plane that's now missing, the Egypt Air plane that happened in Africa. It's really a security problem that they're having. And I can tell you, we've been working with them very, very closely on bringing meta-leadership. They're working on it. But the real problem is a security problem. So the next time you go to the airport, thank the screener that you meet, because they're having a really, really hard time. They get a lot of negative feedback from the public. And if you simply say, just try it, they say, thank you for keeping our skies safe, and watch the reaction that you get. Because we've studied them, we've interviewed a lot of them, and we asked them, why do you do what you do? Just the same question. I said, why do you do this? And they said, when I get off my shift and I'm walking out of the airport and I see a plane in the sky and I know that all of those people are safe, that's why I come to work here every day. And what they get is a lot of pushback because they don't have enough screeners to do the job because of the way the budget's working. So they need a lot of support, and we're studying them, we're working with them, they're an important agency. So, but usually when we study a crisis, we have to get on an airplane and go to New Orleans or to Washington or Atlanta or someplace. Well, then the Boston Marathon bombings occurred. And many of the people who were leaders in that event were graduates of the NPLI and were very consciously using meta-leadership. So just one example, the supervisor of the Boston Police Department, Billy Evans, who's by the way now the commissioner, was in the NPLI class when this happened. Billy was the fellow who arrested Johar Tsarnaev, remember the younger brother that got out and there was a manhunt? And what happened is they had closed down the city, they didn't find him, he was hiding in a boat behind someone's home. So after they lifted the shelter and order requirement for the community, this guy David Hennessy goes back to his boat, he sees that the tarp is ripped, there's blood, and so he calls the police. Billy just happened to be the closest police official at the time. So Billy goes over there, and the way Billy tells the story, he gets there, he's a Boston police supervisor, so he's got a Watertown police guy on one side, he's got a state police guy on the other side. So he says, so I go up, and I walk up to the boat, and I look inside, there's somebody in there, there's something sharp pointing out. He said, I didn't know if it was a gun or a finger, but I decided to pull back. He says, there I am standing at the end of the driveway. Mass police on one side, Watertown police on the other side, and there are 150 guys standing behind me, all with guns pointed at my back. So I said, well, Billy, what did you do? He said, well, I went to the basement. And then he said, I was very, very focused. And his objective was no friendly fire incidents, and he wanted to get the guy alive. And if you listen to the police tape of his comments and what he did, it was an extraordinary example of leadership. And he later became our commissioner for the Boston Police Department. He's an extraordinary leader. He is really a meta-leader. So we interviewed a lot of people following the Boston Marathon bombings to get their stories. to try and understand what happened. And among the people that we interviewed was the governor of the state, Deval Patrick, and he was an extraordinary elected official because he would go into the heads of the police and the emergency managers, and he didn't go in and start giving them directives, didn't give them operational directions. He said, "How can I help?" And they say, "Well, Governor, we need you to be part of this decision to keep the public transportation open or closed." Or, "Governor, we need you to make this press conference. Here's what you need to say." And he was extraordinary as an elected official leader in that event. So when we interviewed him, he said that as a former prosecutor, he knows that it's important to have someone in charge of the investigation. So as he explained it to us, he informally polled everyone, and the consensus around the room was that it should be the head of the FBI, Rick DeLoria. So after everybody agreed to that, he went around like an airline attendant in the exit row of an airplane, and he said, "Are you okay with Rick DeLoria being in charge of the investigation?" And the person had to verbally say yes, and then the next person, "Are you okay with Rick DeLoria being in charge of the," and they had to say yes. That was pretty interesting. So then we interviewed Rick DeLoria, and we said, "Rick, what did the government do?" And he explained exactly the same story. One of the most difficult decisions they had to make early on in the response to the marathon was whether to keep the public transportation system open or closed. There were 2 bombs, and don't forget there were 4 bombs in London, 4 bombs in Madrid, 4 planes on 9/11. They thought there was more to come. Do you keep the public transportation system open on the possibility that there would be more bombs, or do you close it? How many people would keep it open? How many people would close it? Okay, it was a tough decision. They decided to keep it open because there were thousands of people in Boston. There was a fear that they might be a target. And the way they kept it open is they got all the agencies to work together to patrol all of the subways, the buses, the stations in order to maintain safety. It was an extraordinary example of connectivity of effort. So we're interviewing Rick, and I said, "Well, Rick, where were you when the decision was made to keep the public transportation system open?" He says, "Well, I wasn't there." I said, "But Rick, the governor said you were in charge." He said, "I was in charge of the investigation. I wasn't in charge of the operation." So I said, "Well, then who was in charge of the operation?" And he paused for a moment. He says, "Well, I guess no one." And then he was surprised, and we were surprised, because whenever we've studied the response to a major crisis, we've always found that someone was in charge. And we went back to our office and went through all of our notes, and it turned out he was right. No one was in charge of the operation. And by many metrics, it was very successful. Everyone who survived the initial bombing, 3 people were instantly killed. All those people who were terribly injured all survived because of great first aid on the street, use of tourniquets, very, very quick evacuation, perfect distribution to all the hospitals, quick response at the hospitals. Everyone survived. The bad guys were caught in 102 hours. And in keeping with the theme of today, Boston really was resilient. When we said it was Boston strong, it really was. So we tried to figure it out. We went through all of our notes, and it was a puzzle until one day my colleague Eric McNulty walked into my office and he said, "Swarm intelligence." And I said, "Well, what's swarm intelligence?" He says, "It's a science that understands how creatures like bees and ants and termites are able to work together when no one is in charge." And so we studied a lot about swarm intelligence, and we thought, well, maybe this was a phenomenon that occurred in Boston because nobody was in charge. So going through our notes, we looked at what were the themes, and we came up with the 5 principles and rules of swarm intelligence that we translate into the 5 rules of swarm leadership. And I just want to very quickly go through them. You have them on the sheet. The first in Boston, unity of mission. Everybody was committed to save lives. And we heard it over and over again. And people did extraordinary acts, tremendous courage and heroism to save lives. Second principle was generosity of spirit and action. You know, one of the people we interviewed, I asked him, well, at the end, "Well, Danny, what were you most guilty about?" Chief of the Boston Police. I said, "Danny, what were you most guilty about?" He says, "You know, when we had that manhunt, and we had all those tactical people in the neighborhood, thousands of people," he said, "at the command center, we had food and water. He said, but out there, we send all those guys out there, no food, no water, no bathroom facilities, the whole day. What, can you imagine that, what we did? So we investigated. Those guys had all the food and water they needed because they went in to search someone's home to make sure it was safe. People said, hey guys, you need some sandwiches? Want to use our bathroom? Here's some water. Generosity of spirit and action. Number 3, everyone stayed in their own lanes. They did the job of their agency or the job, whether it was the runners or the police or the Boston Emergency Medical Services, etc. Everybody did their job and helped others succeed in their lane. The 4th was no ego, no blame. No one through that whole response said, I did it, or my agency did it, or we're responsible for the success, and nobody pointed fingers. Interestingly, in our interviews, it came up a little bit later in the interview, and people said that was the most important of these principles. And the 4th was a foundation of trusting relations. These people knew one another, they respected one another, and in tense moments when there were difficult decisions to make, they trusted one another. And so we came up with these 5 rules and principles of swarm intelligence or swarm leadership. And then we went back to these leaders. And I called up Rick Deloria, the FBI special agent in charge. And I said, Rick, this is what we came up with. And he said, Lenny, I didn't know that that's what we were doing. It describes exactly what we were doing. We call this swarm leadership. Now, let me conclude by going back to Raji of Poland. The piece that we're pondering right now, so we're continuing to do research and thinking on this, is that we humans are intended to swarm as well. It's easy to see the bees swarming or the ants or other creatures swarming, but we believe that we have some instinct in us to swarm as well. As one example, my parents lived in this small town, and within 5 blocks were all of their grandparents and uncles and aunts and cousins. They lived in a little swarm. So I'm the first generation out of the swarm. I live in Boston, my son lives in Washington, they live in Milwaukee. We've spread out. And we believe that we human beings as a species, just a generation or 2 ago or 3 ago, when I do this in a large group, usually there's no one that's more than 3 or 4 generations away from their family swarm, that we have swarming instincts as well. Because of airplanes and transportation, we don't live in these small units as we did before. But when crises hit, when it's really important for people to come together, we find that these instincts arise. And as I've studied Joplin, the response here, now so moved to be here, talking with people who were part of this response here and talking with them in Washington and in Boston, there was some aspect of swarm leadership that emerged here in Joplin and certainly that emerged in other communities around the country. For us, this is a question. It's what we're studying. For you, we hope it will be an inspiration because you have given us so much to learn and so much inspiring, and we hope to continue sharing these questions with you. Thank you very much.